Everybody, welcome to Module 15 of IS 326. Today we're talking about sport, identity, and politics in Africa. If you had been asked to make a list of the 15 topics you thought we might cover in IS 326 when you begin the class, if you hadn't looked at the syllabus and whatnot, you might not have put sports on the list. But there's a reason why, and it's because these two things really go together. Identity, which is culture and nationalism and stuff all built in, and politics, which is how they govern the countries and what they're trying to accomplish when they're trying to unify their country. So sport plays into both those things, and it plays into international relations, and it plays into relations with expatriate communities of migrants who are living in other parts of the world. It all comes together in sport, and it's a very important thing in a lot of African countries. And we may be talking about different sports in different countries, but the idea generally is that sport can be used as this tool, and we'll talk more about that here as we go along. I should tell you that I am interested in talking with you further if you'd like to explore these ideas more. I know Dr. Fat Chow is the official teacher of the course, and I know it's the end of the semester. You may want to move on to the final exam and other things, but if you'd like to explore these ideas further, I am in the Martin Institute in Admin 338. The email is bill@uidaho.edu, and I'd be happy to chat with you more if you'd like. If not, no worries. Just keep this in mind as you go throughout your life thinking and understanding something about Africa. So the first part of our exploration here is this idea that the sport can be used as a way to unify. Keep in mind that, as context, that before independence, there was something that united African states internally, right? Internally, they, not necessarily everybody, because there were always folks who worked for the colonizing power, but internally, anyone who wanted independence sort of pushed, their unity was to push against the colonial master, whether that was the United Kingdom or France or Portugal or Belgium. They were pushing against that colonial master. So that brought people together across ethnic lines, across different lines of culture, across different things where they may have had long-term enmities or conflict, or sometimes you don't need enmity, you just need nothing in common. So if you're in Ghana where there's more than 90 ethnic groups, it doesn't mean that they were all lined up against each other. It could mean that somebody in the southwest corner of the country and somebody in the northeast corner of the country, they never encountered each other, those cultures, once upon a time, because those were not proximal states. They might have traded, they might have had some sort of small scale encounter, but there was nothing in common. So you could have enmity, you could have nothing in common, you could have stuff in common, but that idea of pushing the colonizing power out was what unified you. The problem is that once independence is achieved, you might revert back to those 90 different ethnic groups or whatever it is in the particular country. So you can consciously use sports as a way to overcome ethnic borders and create national borders. An ethnic mindset to a national mindset. It's not a perfect science, but all the way from 1957 on, when Kwame Nkrumah said, I will use the soccer team to unify my country, he sets up a symbol, a visual symbol of unity. Now, there was a flag, and there was a government, and there was a currency, but those are things that take time for people to buy into, whereas sport, particularly if you have success, is something that people can buy into more quickly if they have already an existing affinity for that sport. So the good news is that he was able to draw from, and the coaches there were able to draw from, a wide range of ethnic groups to form the soccer team. He set up a symbol, the Black Stars. It's the same star that's on the Ghanaian flag. It's on the Ghanaian soccer jersey, right? And so the team is called the Black Stars. It's the unifying symbol. And across the continent, you have these unifying symbols that the countries use. So a lot of times it's a totemic animal, not a mascot the way we think of them, like the Detroit Lions. The Lions of Cameroon, the indomitable lions, that's a totemic animal, an animal invested with power and something that you're looking for that's not just a cutesy thing that prances on the sidelines. So this is Samuel Eto'o. He's a famous soccer player from Cameroon, and that idea of that common symbol is important ones there. It wasn't always a positive thing, because in South Africa, for example, the common symbol was actually only common to a particular ethnic group, right? This is the white Afrikaners. The rugby team was represented by the Springbok, and that emblem was a very powerful one in creating racial disharmony, or enforcing that racial disharmony between black and white. There's a shift in 1995, we'll talk about briefly later, where it comes to represent more than just the whites, but it's not always things. So it's an attempt to unify. So you might unify across the whole country. In South Africa's case, they're unifying across an ethnic group and the like. So you've got that on. There's also a peculiar rhythm to international sports. And so for something to be useful in creating a sense of unity and to actually politically use it, sport can't just happen every 4 years, for example, in a World Cup. What if you don't qualify for the World Cup? It can't just be in the Olympics. What if your runners aren't fast enough to go to the Olympics? So sporting events have a rhythm. And so, like soccer, for example, has a World Cup every 4 years. The African Cup of Nations happens every 2 years. It's another competition. And then you have qualifying games to get into those competitions. So you end up with the national team having 10 or so games every year where you can trot out that symbol regularly. You can also do things like participate in those games, common games like the Commonwealth. We talked about the Commonwealth very briefly in that other unit I did, where you have the common linkage across the former British Empire. The French games, the athletics championships, so track and field has a rhythm, tennis has a rhythm, running has a rhythm where there's major tournaments across the world. So that rhythm is something that repeats, right, much more quickly than we sort of think of when you say it's the World Cup every 4 years. Qualifying takes 2 years before that. Qualifying for the other tournaments happens before that. So you actually end up with an almost continuous round of this international sporting competition. So it's more useful than it might seem right away because that rhythm keeps things going. And that is true across different sports. So depending on what your country turns to use, you can have that more or less frequently, but it is more frequently than the only in the championships. So that's important. So where did it all start? Where did this national identity really launch? So I did mention Kwame Nkrumah in 1957, but to prove success and have sort of a period in which African states writ large are going to use sports, it starts in 1960, and it starts with a man named Abebe Bikila, who's an Ethiopian marathoner. Now, if you look up Abebe Bikila in a lot of sites, what they'll tell you is that he won the marathon gold medal in the Olympics in 1960 running barefoot, and that's true. But that misses the part where it's sport, identity, and politics. Him running barefoot is sport. Sport and identity would be him as an Ethiopian man running on behalf of the nation. He was a representative of Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia. He was part of his imperial guards. But he wore the colors of Ethiopia, right? He goes out in to represent the country. Now, the politics part is interesting. So Rome, Italy, Rome is where the Olympics is held in 1960. Italy, under Benito Mussolini, had conquered Ethiopia. It is part of World War II. So in the 1930s, they conquer Ethiopia. They don't get out of Ethiopia until the mid-1940s, 1945. 1960 is only 15 years later. Then you have an Ethiopian man running past the major Italian architecture, their greatness and their history, and running to the gates of Rome is where the marathon ended. It was a very high-profile event. And to have that sort of post-colonial or neo-colonial relationship where you're saying, okay, this was the country that dominated us. We're a small country going up against our former colonizer and having him win the gold in very visible fashion, right? It's not that he won Taekwondo, and Taekwondo can matter in some countries. He won the marathon, which is a high-profile event, ran to the gates of Rome. We got some film of this. You'll see as part of this unit, I provided several links to the things I'm going to be talking about here. I definitely encourage you to go watch that and watch him run, but they're not talking about the politics part. You can watch it transpire on the screen if you know what you're looking for him running in Italy 15 years after the conqueror was kicked out. So once you have this sort of launch, other states look at that and say, look what can happen. Now, this wasn't conscious. They weren't saying, we're going to train a marathon runner to conquer in Italy. It sort of happens, but once it happens, then other states start to think more conscientiously about what they're going to do. So in the 1960s, there's sort of two different themes going on at the same time. Now, this is a slide that I quite like, and I like this example because in the mid-1960s, you have two very famous African athletes. One is a man named Eusebio, who's from Mozambique. And one's Kip Keino, who's from Kenya. So you have this Kenyan running tradition. It's sort of, he's not the first winner of a medal in Kenya, but he's this very visible one because he destroys his American and British competitors. And the idea that you can be a small country beating a superpower on an international stage is a big one and an interesting one. So he launches it. You can watch film about these people. But what it shows is a different thing. Kenya had become independent from the United Kingdom. Mozambique was still colonized by Portugal, which means that when he's a famous African athlete, he competes for Portugal in the World Cup. He's actually the best player in the world in 1966, but he's European and he's African at the same time. So it's kind of a complicated relationship, and it shows sort of the two tracks that Africa's on in the 1960s. Countries still waiting to gain independence, countries already independent and working and running for and on behalf of themselves. So these symbols on the uniforms, symbols on the jerseys are different. Eusebio's symbol is the Portuguese symbol. Kaino symbol is the symbol for Kenya. It's a big difference in it, and it launches them differently. There's film of both these men here in the module. The 1970s has sort of a different theme. It's one of isolation. First, because the world tries to put pressure on South Africa to end apartheid. We looked at that early in the semester. That racist political ideology that kept the 75-80% of the population that was black down in South Africa, and so the global community isolated South Africa by prohibiting them from participating in sports. The one exception was in rugby, where the rugby union let the white South African teams can still compete against New Zealand. They had this powerful identity. It was a white team against another team in New Zealand. And what the African states, the rest of Africa, wanted to have happen was for the Olympic movement to kick out New Zealand for playing games, rugby games against South Africa. And so when the International Olympic Committee refused to do that, the African teams, almost entirely all of them, boycotted the 1976 Olympics. So there's sort of this major theme of the 1970s is one of isolation, with one exception, and the exception is a very important boxing match called the Rumble in the Jungle, which takes place in Zaire in the mid-1970s between George Foreman here on the far left and Muhammad Ali here on the right, hosted by Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire, who put up $25 million for the privilege of hosting this fight. It's a fascinating example of hosting for legitimacy, trying to gain something for your country by putting on a major sporting event. It's chronicled in a fantastic Academy Award-winning documentary called When We Were Kings that I recommend to you very highly. You'll notice themes that an average American sports fan won't notice because you've been in this class, but see what Mobutu's tried to do by hosting the event. The 80s is a little different, particularly with soccer, where they start to have some real success. There's a match in 1982 I'd love to tell you about if I had time, but I don't, that sort of launches the standard for what things will be like. In 1990, there's a very famous player named Roger Milla, who we have clips from, but Cameroon had the honor of opening the Olympics in 1990 when they played defending champion Argentina, and they beat Argentina. And the idea then that this major power in the global sporting sense, and certainly a country with more to offer at the time economically and politically than Cameroon, loses this match that's viewed by an estimated 20% of the global global audience. Everyone in the world is a big deal. They go all the way to the quarterfinals. It's important. George Weah, he's Liberian. It's the first time in the 1990s that an African is named the World Footballer of the Year, the best soccer player on the planet. He played for AC Milan. He becomes an important political figure, both in trying to end the civil war in Liberia and in politics. Please watch the clip on him. There's a couple other themes that I want you to watch. Bonus coverage, both in Namibia as they became independent and Frankie Fredericks running for them. There's a great BBC story I want you to listen to. It's about 10 minutes long. And there's an interview with Francois Pienaar, who is the captain of South Africa's World Cup winning team in 1995, and the role that Nelson Mandela played in uniting the country through rugby, which had been a way to divide the country. So it's sort of bonus coverage I'd like you to consider. And then there's some 21st century themes that I want you to explore. There's also some clips on this. The one is using NGOs using sport and play for development and peace projects. So that could be UNICEF or others, or it could be Right to Play. This picture's here from Right to Play. And as far as inclusion goes, there's an attempt both to change the way gender relations work through sport and an attempt to integrate people who are really cast aside. There's no tradition in the modern era in Africa for including people who are disabled. So folks who came out of those horrific conflicts of the 1990s, where people were losing limbs both to landmines and to really brutal tactics from rebel groups where they would just machete chop off limbs. One way to do that is this development of amputee soccer and its role in trying to do integration. These are new themes that I would suggest that you can study for how sports sort of goes together, and the political groups can work them out. So what are my final thoughts? Well, as you can see from my rushed delivery through a lot of this, there's a lot to say about this. You got an article about separate Ghanaian club teams and the different political identities of parties who identify with the different teams. You still have that push through Ghana. Ghana, who is in the 2006 and 2014 World Cups, eliminated the United States and continued on in the tournament. That's that idea of that little country representing something positive, right? They're beating a superpower on the global stage in something positive. And then there's this sort of collective belief that they can win and be the best at something that's a positive narrative. Positive narratives matter in Africa, and sports is one of the places they turn to lots.